At the end of Fast and Furious 6, Dom and Brian had a choice: hand over the weapon, take the pardon, go home clean. But what if they didn't? What if instead they kept it, disappeared, and built something the world had never seen? Not a crew, not a gang, an empire. This is that story. The Antonov transport plane burns at the far end of the runway. Black smoke unravels into a Mediterranean sky that has no interest in their sins. Owen Shaw lies broken somewhere behind them. Letty is alive. The family is whole. And in Dominic Toretto's hands, wrapped in carbon fiber housing barely larger than a hardback novel, is the nightshade device. Hobbs is 50 yards away, limping toward them across the cracked tarmac, hand extended, eyes carrying that particular American authority that has never quite learned the word no. Beside Dom, Brian O'Connor stares at the device. His FBI mind catalogs it automatically. COI-class weapon, cripple on impact, range, national grid, yield, darkness. Handed over to Toretto, Hobbs calls, his voice carrying over the dying roar of jet turbines. Dom doesn't move, neither does Brian. In the 3 seconds that follow, they have a conversation without words, the kind that only exists between men who have bled together, who have stood over each other's graves and dragged each other back. Brian's blue eyes say, "This is it. This is how they own us forever. One job leads to another, the pardon becomes a leash." Dom's dark eyes answer, "Then we cut it." Brian looks down at the device. "We keep it," Brian says, barely a whisper. "We disappear." Dom lifts his chin, turns to face Hobbs fully. When he speaks, his voice carries no aggression, no bravado, just the clean certainty of a man who has made peace with a very large, very permanent decision. "Tell Washington we're dead," Dom says. "Make it convincing." He tucks the nightshade beneath his jacket. Hobbs stops walking. His jaw tightens. For a moment, the entire runway holds its breath. Every atom of air between these two enormous men, charged with the knowledge that this moment cannot be undone. Then Hobbs does something no one in his 20-year career has ever witnessed. He nods. Not agreement, not approval, but recognition, the recognition of one sovereign force encountering another. "I'll find you," he says. "When the world needs you." "The world won't know where to look," Brian replies. They walk to the cars. They don't run. Kings don't run. 18 months later, the Atlantic is unimpressed by money. It doesn't care about sovereignty or satellite blackout zones, or the $6 billion in cascading infrastructure quietly reorganized under 100 shell corporations across 43 countries. It moves when it wants to move. It swallows what it chooses to swallow. The ocean's indifference is, Dom has decided, the most honest thing in the world. He stands at the edge of the sector, their word, their territory, theirs, and watches the sun cut apart on the water. The sector is a miracle of contradiction. From satellite imagery, it appears to be a decommissioned oil platform sitting in international waters 340 miles west of the Canary Islands. In reality, it is the crown jewel of a private sovereign nation that exists nowhere in any international treaty, recognized by no government, and capable of defending itself from most that might try. Its surface area spans 2 square kilometers of engineered steel and reclaimed coral reef. Beneath the waterline, 4 levels of pressurized facility house everything from server architecture running the world's most sophisticated analog hybrid routing system, to a garage that would make Koenigsegg weep with envy. The money, at first, was the easy part. 100 million from the Rio Vault, routed through Han's Tokyo contacts and into high-frequency trading networks across Singapore and Zurich, had compounded into something obscene, not enough for an empire, but enough for a foundation. The real leverage was logistics. After the Shaw Syndicate's operation fell apart, their ghost shipping infrastructure, 14% of all untracked global cargo, was suddenly parentless, and Dom and Brian had simply stepped in and become the new parents. Nobody had filed a complaint. Nobody had known who to file it with. Brian had designed the analog hybrid system himself. Over 9 months and 3 whiteboards, his FBI pattern recognition mind fused with an engineer's instinct for physical permanence. The architecture was, in concept, elegant. Cutting-edge AI buried inside 1970s analog relay hardware that no digital intrusion tool in the world was programmed to recognize. Because the world had forgotten the old frequencies. You couldn't hack what you couldn't see. You couldn't see what you couldn't conceive of looking for. Brian had been very proud of it, briefly, before pride became another luxury he didn't have time for. Han had designed the car systems before Tokyo. Roman built the entertainment wing and refuses to discuss the budget. Tage Parker engineered the tech stack in a fugue state that lasted 11 months and left him lighter by 12 pounds and sharper by an order of magnitude that frightens even him. Letty and Mia ran security and logistics, respectively, with an efficiency that had never been questioned twice by the same person. And Dom stands at the railing, thinking about his father. Jack Toretto died on a racetrack. Not in a crash that was made to look like an accident by a man who needed him gone. Dom spent 20 years thinking his father was a failure. He spent the next 10 learning his father was a martyr. Now, in the 48th year of his life, he is beginning to wonder if he has become something worse than either. Sector Command is tracking a UN maritime vessel. Tage's voice crackles through the earpiece. Brazilian registration, agency flags all over the hull transponder. They're running dark, but their radar signature is Standard Task Force 6. How many aboard? 42, plus a HIHEB they haven't deployed yet. Brian? Brian O'Connor's voice comes in from the operations center, 3 floors below. He sounds calm. He always sounds calm now, which worries Dom more than anything else. The Brian he knew used to wear his adrenaline like a second skin, loose and visible. This Brian folds it away somewhere you can't see it. I've got the blackout field charged to 60%. That's enough to cover a 3-kilometer radius. Their navigation, comms, weapons electronics, all of it goes dark the moment I trigger. Non-lethal? They'll be confused for 6 to 8 hours. Their backup systems will restore. No permanent damage. A pause. On the water, the task force vessel is a gray comma against the blue sentence of the horizon. Do it, Dom says. The blackout doesn't announce itself. There's no visible pulse, no dramatic discharge. One moment the vessel is a functioning naval unit, the next it is a 42-person steel room with no lights, no engines, and a radio that has forgotten what radio is. Dom picks up the emergency frequency broadcast microphone. His voice goes out on every band the vessel might be monitoring. You've entered restricted sovereign territory. No harm will come to you. Your systems will restore in approximately 6 hours. Use that time to reconsider your orders. A pause. The pause is important. It cannot sound rushed. We have no interest in conflict. This is our world. Turn around. For 17 minutes, nothing moves. Then the vessel begins a slow, correctionless drift westward, away from the sector, carrying with it 42 men who will spend the rest of their careers explaining what happened without ever being believed. Dom clicks off the broadcast. Behind him, the door to the observation deck opens. Mia Toretto O'Connor does not announce herself. She never does. She stands beside him, and they look at the water for a long time before she speaks. Jack asked me today why we live on a boat, she says. Dom is quiet. He's 6 years old, Mia continues. He's never had a yard. He's never ridden a bike on a street. He's never... She stops, resets. I told him we lived here because it was special. He said, "Is it more special than home?" She turns to look at Dom. I didn't have an answer. We're safe here. Brian hasn't slept in 4 days. He calls it operations tempo. He used to call it insomnia and actually talk to me about it. She doesn't raise her voice. She never raises her voice with Dom, which means every word lands with the weight of everything unsaid. The family is still the family, Dom. But I'm watching Brian become someone else, someone with better tactics and fewer feelings. Below them, through the armored observation glass, Dom can see into the garage level. The black Charger sits beside the Skyline R34. Both cars are immaculate, maintained with religious attention, driven less and less often with each passing month. Mia follows his gaze. He polishes it. She says softly, the R34, 3 times a week, like he's trying to remember something. Dom doesn't answer, but he stands at the railing for a long time after she goes inside, watching the empty horizon where the task force vessel used to be. The God's Eye is not a weapon. It is a keyhole. Brian had explained it to Dom 18 months earlier, using a whiteboard and 4 different colors of marker and a certainty that scared both of them. If the God's Eye is in hostile hands, agency hands, state hands, anyone's hands, we are not sovereign. We are surveilled. The Empire is a glass house. The God's Eye needed to be theirs. The problem was Ramsey. She had disappeared after the Nightshade incident, her location known only to Mr. Nobody, whose real name, Brian had eventually established through 4 months of methodical intelligence work, was Curtis Drake, Deputy Director, Special Activities Division, CIA. The kind of man who had never lost a game of chess in his life, and would therefore never recognize a player who didn't play chess. Brian didn't play chess. He played football. He played on the line. He played for the moment when the defensive front collapses and you're already through before anyone knows you moved. The operation to extract Ramsey from Nobody's protection had 3 phases. Phase 1, establish contact. Phase 2, demonstrate irreplaceability. Phase 3, make an offer she couldn't ethically refuse. It was Phase 2 that required Brian to do something he had not done since he left the FBI with a forged death certificate in somebody's filing cabinet. He called his old mentor. Agent David Stasiak had been Brian O'Connor's supervisor during the early days. He was not, technically, a corrupt man, but he was a transactional one, a distinction Brian had once found important and now found mostly irrelevant. Stasiak had information. Stasiak could be leveraged, and Brian was no longer the young man who believed that the how was as important as the what. The meeting happened in a parking garage in Lisbon. Brian arrived in a rental Fiat and a gray jacket. He looked by design like nothing. An accountant, a tourist, a ghost. Stasiak had aged 20 years in the 6 since Brian had last seen him. "You're supposed to be dead," Stasiak said. "Perception management," Brian replied without apology. "I need Ramsey's location." "I don't." "I know you do. You're on Drake's oversight committee. I know because your assistant uses the same encrypted calendar app as 6 other operatives we've identified. And your calendar has a standing Tuesday briefing called GE Status, which stands for God's Eye Status, every week for the last 8 months. Brian's voice carried no heat. Just information, delivered with the clean precision of a man who has done his homework so thoroughly that lying becomes not just futile, but embarrassing. "I'm not asking you to betray anyone. I'm asking you to accept that the God's Eye is safer with us than with Drake. And if I say no..." Brian looked at him for a long moment. "Then I make 17 calls that you'll spend the next 5 years explaining. Not to your superiors, to your family." He paused. "I don't want to do that, David. I genuinely don't. But I'll tell you the truth. I'm not the person I was when you knew me. I do what needs to be done." Stasiak looked at the floor, at the ceiling, at somewhere in between. "She's in Cologne," he said finally. "Drake has her in a residential facility. Looks like a university campus. 3-layer security." Brian nodded. "Thank you." He drove the rental Fiat out of the parking garage and didn't look back. In the elevator to the operations floor of the sector, 3 days later, he rode alone with what he'd done. He had threatened a man he once respected. He had leveraged family, the one thing Dom's code said you never touched. He had done it because it was effective, and effectiveness had become, somewhere in the architecture of the last 18 months, the primary filter through which he evaluated his choices. He thought about how easily it had come. He thought about the look on Stasiak's face. He polished the R-34 that night for 2 hours. Ramsey, once extracted, willingly it turned out, once she understood who was asking and why, spent 6 weeks integrating the God's Eye into the sector's hybrid network. She did it with the focused pleasure of someone given a piano the size of a city to play. "You've built something extraordinary," she told Brian, on the day the integration went live and the God's Eye opened its aperture over the entire globe from their servers. "You should be terrified of yourself." "I am," Brian said. "Good," she said. "That means there's still someone in there worth saving." Deckard Shaw came for the God's Eye 4 months after that. He came alone, which was either supremely confident or supremely stupid, and with Deckard Shaw those categories had always overlapped. He got within 80 meters of the sector's outer perimeter before Brian's countermeasures locked onto his biometrics. There was no fight, no car chase, no cathartic exchange of violence. Brian simply closed every door. Shaw's accounts, all 19 of them, across 11 jurisdictions, zeroed. His identity documents ceased to exist. His credit history became a blank page. And in the cell where Brian had routed him, a pressurized security room deep in the sector's lower level, The oxygen flow reduced to a level that was survivable, but deeply persuasively uncomfortable. When the door opened, Shaw was sitting on the floor, breathing carefully, his expression one of genuine surprise. "You didn't fight," Shaw said. "Fighting is what people do when they're not sure they'll win," Brian replied. "I was sure." Shaw looked at him for a long time. "The cop is gone, isn't he?" Brian didn't answer, but Shaw saw it in the silence, the way it sat differently than denial. Heavier, more honest. He held up both hands. "I'll walk," he said. "You'll work," Brian corrected. "For us. Or, I restore your accounts and flag every intelligence agency in Europe to your biometrics in the next 60 seconds. Shaw laughed, not the theatrical laugh of a man performing confidence, but the genuine, slightly resigned laugh of a man who has just recognized a better player. "Terms?" he asked. "Reasonable," Brian said. Shaw tilted his head, reading the full geometry of the man in front of him, the posture that had cop written into its architecture, but the eyes that belonged to something else entirely, something that had taken the cop's frame and refilled it with a different fuel. He had met killers who looked softer. He had met saints who looked harder. He had never met anyone who looked so precisely, carefully finished, like a weapon that had been taken apart and reassembled without the safety. "You're not what I expected," Shaw said. "I know," Brian replied. "I'm not what I expected either." He walked Shaw to the door of the secure room, and they stood for a moment in the corridor, with its humming lights and the distant sound of Atlantic water against the hull, two men who had each spent their lives operating in the gap between law and necessity, recognizing in each other something like the grim kinship of soldiers who fought on opposite sides of the same war. "One question," Shaw said. Brian waited. "Is it worth it? The whole—" he gestured vaguely at the surrounding infrastructure. "Architecture. I'll tell you when I know," he said. It was the most honest thing he'd said all month. Cypher does not announce herself. This is not arrogance. It is architecture. She has spent 30 years engineering herself into the spaces between systems. The latency gaps in satellite uplink, the millisecond blind spots in automated monitoring, the institutional assumption that any network sophisticated enough to be worth hacking is sophisticated enough to defend itself. She found the sector's blind spot on a Thursday. By Friday, she was inside. Not physically. She would need an army for that, and armies create signatures. Digitally, which was worse. A ghost in the cathedral, touching every column, learning every weight-bearing point, mapping the structure from inside its own walls. She found the nightshade array first, then the God's Eye integration, then the analog relay system, Brian's crown jewel, the old-world architecture that was supposed to be hack-proof, and she smiled at it, with the particular appreciation of one craftsperson encountering another's masterwork. She found the back door in a 1973 relay chassis that Brian had sourced from a decommissioned Soviet monitoring station. The chassis was authentic. The relay was authentic. The firmware was not. Someone had patched it. Someone who knew exactly what Brian would look for and what he would trust. The message she sent through the breach was 7 words. "I have your keys. Come to me." Dom read it at 0300. He didn't sleep after that. The stakes were not immediately obvious to the crew, and Brian worked through the night to make them so. Cypher didn't have the nightshade. She had the activation codes for the sector's own drone array. 47 autonomous units that had been programmed to defend the compound could, with the right credentials, be reprogrammed to attack it. And she had proof of concept. At 0445, a single drone detached from its holding pattern and flew one slow, deliberate pass over the Toretto residence in Los Angeles. The old house, the family house, the place with the barbecue in the backyard, and the cars in the garage, before returning to its station. The message was clear. She could reach them anywhere. She could reach anyone they loved. Dom sat in the operations center and felt, for the first time since the tarmac, something he had been armoring against for 18 months. Fear, not for himself, not even for the Empire, for the boy. For Mia's son, Jack. For Elena's son, whose name was also Dom, and who represented everything the original Dom had been trying to outrun when he built a fortress in the ocean, something innocent, something that deserved better than a father who was also a general. Brian's voice, when he finally spoke, came out wrong. Too controlled, the way a river sounds when it's running underground. "I can counter the drone override with a hard system reset," he said. But the reset requires a 40-second blackout of all our defensive systems. She'll be inside the outer layer before we can bring them back. So we stop her before the reset, Tej offered. She's routing through 14 countries. I've got 5 traces running. She cuts them and moves every time I get close. Brian's jaw tightened. She's better than me. The room absorbed this quietly. She's better than the tech, Brian corrected himself. She's exploiting the analog layer because it's the one thing she doesn't need to hack digitally. She can just understand it. She thinks in analog. Same as me. He looked at Dom. There's only one way to stop her. Dom saw it before Brian said it. The nightshade, Dom said. A localized pulse, wide enough to cover our entire network. It destroys the drone override codes and everything else. Every system, every database, every God's Eye integration, every logistics route. Brian spread his hands on the table, a gesture of laying something down that was also the gesture of a man letting go of something he built. The empire takes a decade to rebuild, maybe never gets rebuilt. Or it burns, Tej said very quietly. Or it burns, Brian confirmed. Dom stood. He walked to the window. Below, in the Atlantic, the drone array sat motionless, 47 chrome birds waiting for their reprogrammed instructions. Above, somewhere in the unreachable architecture of satellite coverage, Cypher sat like a spider at the exact center of a web she had taken apart thread by thread and reassembled her way. The boy, Dom said, not a question. If she triggers those drones toward LA, he's gone before we can respond, Brian said. I can't stop it remotely. The system will execute. Dom turned from the window. Blow the nightshade, he said. Brian looked at him. There was something in Brian's face that Dom hadn't seen in months. Not the general, not the strategist, but the man Brian had been before the weight of it all had pressed him into a different shape. Sadness. Simple, clean sadness. The whole thing, Brian confirmed. The whole thing. His hands moved to the console. The nightshade pulse that fired at 0611 on a Thursday morning was not dramatic. No flash, no concussion, no visible evidence of what it consumed. The drone array fell from the sky in neat, lifeless formation, splashing into the Atlantic in a half-kilometer arc. The servers died mid-cycle. The God's Eye went dark. The analog relays, Brian's brilliant paranoid masterpiece, simply stopped. Silence in the frequencies where their empire had lived. Cypher, wherever she was, felt the entire architecture go dark and understood immediately what it meant. The message was in the absence. We chose the boy. She left them alone after that, not because she was defeated, because she was a professional, and professionals recognize when they've already won, even when it doesn't look like victory. The sector was still standing, the family was still breathing, but the empire had taken its first wound, and everyone in the operations center knew, even those who didn't say it, that wounds like this one don't fully close. Mia found Dom in the garage that night, sitting on the hood of the Charger. The house in LA is safe? She asked. Clean sweep, Dom said. We verified. She sat beside him. They were quiet for a long time. Was it worth building? She asked. Dom thought about it honestly, which was harder than it used to be. Ask me again in a few years, he said. Jacob Toretto has their father's hands. Dom noticed it the moment his younger brother stepped out of the League vehicle in the convoy that had been tailing the sector's supply route for 11 days. Patient, methodical, tactical, the kind of tale that only works if the person running it has inside knowledge, the kind that says, I know you, I know how you think. Jacob had always known how Dom thinks. Coalition of 12 nations, Tej reported, pulling up the satellite imagery. NATO adjacents, plus 3 South American intelligence services who've been wanting the Empire's logistics routes back since we took them. Jacob's been working them for 6 months. Who's running Jacob? Brian asked. Agency? Old world private sector? Hard to say. Tej hesitated. He's got resources, B. He's got our supply routes mapped. He's got a pause. He's got Dad's mechanics working for him. 2 of the guys from the garage. Old-timers. Dom didn't move. But something in the operations room adjusted to the gravity of this information, the way a room adjusts when someone opens a window, everything shifting slightly in one direction. He's not using agency resources, Dom said. He's using family resources, which makes him, Brian said, carefully harder to stop without. Without crossing a line, Dom finished. The Edinburgh chase was not supposed to happen. Brian had planned for a controlled intercept, a highway negotiation, terms exchanged, a political solution to what was, underneath the ideology, a family argument. But Jakob's people had anticipated the plan, the way people do when they are fighting someone they grew up watching. The magnetic warhead was old Soviet technology, decommissioned officially, available unofficially to people with Jakob's contact list. It turned the streets of Edinburgh into a different city, one where cars became missiles, where lampposts became shrapnel, where the geometry of pursuit was rewritten by forces that had no interest in driver skill or horsepower. Dom drove the Charger. Jacob drove a matte gray Aston Martin that had been modified to the point where Aston Martin was a semantic courtesy. They hit the Royal Mile at 140 miles per hour, with 3 warhead drones between them and the city's physics, doing everything wrong. Dom had driven angry before, the kind of anger that makes you faster, sharper, closer to the edge of the road and the center of yourself. This was different. This was cold. This was the feeling of a man driving toward his own reflection and not knowing whether to brake or accelerate. Jakob's voice came over the open frequency. "You became Dad," Jakob said, not as an accusation, as an observation. The worst kind. "I'm nothing like Dad." He built his reputation on fear, too. The Aston Martin matched the Charger's line through a hairpin, the magnetic wake throwing 2 parked vehicles into the facades of Georgian buildings. He told himself it was for the family, said he had no choice, said the world outside was worse. A beat. Sound familiar? Dom yanked the wheel and the Charger hit the opposing lane, cut back, a move that would have worked in any other city on any other day, but the warhead drone between them responded, and for 2 seconds, the world became a very loud and very metal question. They came out of it alive, both cars. Barely. The city was not entirely intact. Dom sat in the Charger at the end of the mile. Engine ticking, the windshield cracked from a piece of iron railing that had arrived through it without invitation. Jacob's Aston Martin sat 30 meters ahead, facing him, both drivers looking at each other through glass. For a moment, Dom saw his father's garage, saw a 12-year-old boy who idolized him, saw the years of competition and pride and the specific cruelty of older brothers who don't yet understand that their shadow can be a dark place to grow up in. He got out of the Charger. Jacob got out of the Aston Martin. They stood on the cobblestones of a city that had just been partially rearranged by their family dispute. And for a moment, neither of them spoke. The Royal Mile at this hour, 5 in the morning, the siege drones dead, the wreckage of 23 displaced vehicles cooling in the early light, smelled of burned rubber and old stone, and the particular melancholy of a place that has witnessed something it didn't ask to witness. They were, Dom realized, about 20 feet apart. 20 feet and 20 years of wrong turns and silence, and the specific damage that older brothers do to younger ones without ever meaning to, because meaning to would require the self-awareness that only comes too late. He looked at Jacob, at the jaw that was their father's, at the hands that were their father's, at the eyes that were entirely Jacob's own, careful, precise, watching. Dom said the thing he should have said 20 years ago. "I'm sorry." Jacob looked at him. "I ruled this family with fear before I ever ruled anything else," Dom said. "I told myself it was strength. It wasn't strength. It was fear pretending to be strength. And I've been doing the same thing in the Atlantic for 2 years. He looked down the mile, at the displaced vehicles, the shattered facades, the crater where a drone had come to rest. I've become the thing I was running from. Jacob was quiet for a long time. "The coalition won't stop," he said finally. "There are people above me who don't care about family arguments. I know." Dom looked up. "Are you above them or below them?" A pause. "That depends on today," Jacob said. Dom held out his hand. Jacob looked at it for a very long time. Then he shook it. Brian drove alone. The R34 Nissan Skyline had been in the sector's garage for 11 months without putting a significant mile on its odometer. It was a shrine to a previous self, the self that had outrun cop cars in Miami and Rio and Tokyo, that had lived in the quarter mile with the purity of a monk, that had believed, genuinely, that speed was a kind of honesty. Brian drove it out through the sector's maritime deployment bay at 020 on a Tuesday, with no briefing filed, no backup arranged, and a wrench in the passenger seat. He had found the trafficking ring in the logistics data. It wasn't hidden, which was the worst part. It was sitting there in the sector's ghost shipping records, like a footnote nobody had thought important enough to address. A subroute, running off one of their main cargo pathways through West Africa, small enough to be statistically invisible against the volume of their network, but large enough, when Brian looked at the cargo manifests, to make his stomach close like a fist. Human cargo, on their routes, not sanctioned, not known. An opportunistic parasite that had read the Empire's shadow and decided to live in it. Brian had brought it to Dom 3 days ago. Dom had said, "We deal with it." Brian had said, "How?" Dom had said, "The way we deal with things." And Brian had looked at him and understood, for the first time with full clarity, what the Empire had become: a bureaucracy. A sovereign bureaucracy with drones and analog firewalls and a God's eye, now partially rebuilt, that dealt with its problems through leverage and countermeasure and the efficient application of institutional force. It was, in the final analysis, the agency with better cars. Brian drove the R-34 to a port town on the Mauritanian coast that had no name on the maps the sector used. He drove without the God's eye, without backup, without, and this was the one that scared him most, a plan. He had a wrench, a firearm with 17 rounds, and the particular brand of furious competence that had always lived closer to the surface than the General Brian he'd been performing for 18 months. The town materialized out of the dark the way poor coastal towns do. Light before skyline, sound before light. The smell of salt and diesel, and the specific melancholy of a place that the world's economic architecture passes through without slowing down. He parked the R-34 3 blocks from the port, beside a rusted shipping container whose original color was a question nobody had asked in years, and walked the rest of the way on foot. He did not use his earpiece. He left it in the car. The operation took 11 hours. It was not elegant. It was not tactical. It was the work of a man who had once been very good at a very specific kind of chaos. The organized chaos of someone who could move through a system, find its failure points, and dismantle it from inside with the confidence of a mechanic who has read the manual and also thrown the manual away. 2 of the 17 rounds were used. Brian had been hoping to use none, but the men running the subroute had different ideas. No one died. This mattered to Brian in a way it hadn't always mattered to the general. But several people required significant medical attention, and a warehouse that had been used for purposes that do not warrant specification was now a significantly ventilated structure waiting for an insurance claim that would never come. He found the manifest records in a waterproof lockbox behind a secondary wall. He photographed every page. He left copies for Interpol. He left different copies for 3 separate West African investigative journalists, whose contact details Ramsey had found in the God's Eye database 6 months ago, and flagged as people worth knowing. He had never acted on that flag. He had been too busy being a general. The cargo was released. Authorities were tipped. Not American authorities. Local ones whose jurisdiction could not be quietly rerouted by agency interference. Brian sat on the hood of the R-34 outside the warehouse at 4 a.m, with the wrench in his hands and blood on his jacket that wasn't his. He thought about Mia, about Jack, about the boy they'd named Dom. He thought about the look on Stasiak's face in that parking garage in Lisbon, the look of a man recognizing, with dawning horror, that the young agent he'd mentored had traveled somewhere past the map's edge. He thought about the God's Eye, about the blackout fields, about the sector's 16 layers of operational security, and how none of it, not one encrypted relay, not one drone, not one analog circuit board, had been on that warehouse floor tonight. Tonight had been him and a wrench, and the bone-deep certainty that this was wrong and it had to stop. He thought about Dom on the Edinburgh cobblestones, saying, "I ruled this family with fear before I ever ruled anything else." He thought about how Dom had meant it as self-indictment, but how there was something else in it too, something that sounded, underneath the guilt, like relief. The relief of a man who has finally found the edge of the map and can stop pretending it doesn't exist. Brian had been managing the Empire's moral rot for 2 years by routing around it, treating it as an infrastructure problem, a systems problem, a problem with solutions that could be applied at scale. But you can't route around a human being. You can't firewall a person's dignity. Some problems need a wrench, and 17 rounds and a man willing to get blood on his jacket in a town with no name at 4 a.m. on a Tuesday. He drove back to the sector at dawn, watching the sun come up over the water. He parked the R-34 in the garage. He sat in it for a long time, both hands on the wheel. He was crying. He didn't notice until he tasted salt. Not grief, not guilt, or not only guilt, something else. Something like the feeling you get when you find something you thought was gone. The buster had not died in that Lisbon parking garage. He'd just been driving the wrong car. Dante Reyes arrives like a bad joke, told very slowly. He doesn't want the empire. He doesn't want the money, the tech, the God's eye, the sovereignty. He doesn't want to dismantle the sector from the outside, because dismantling it from the outside is what governments do, and governments are boring, and Dante Reyes is the opposite of boring. He wants them to watch themselves burn. His father, Hernan Reyes, the Rio drug lord whose vault they had dragged through the city behind 2 Dodge Chargers, had believed in respect earned through dominance. Dante has spent 8 years developing a more sophisticated thesis. Respect is irrelevant. What matters is exposure. The empire of Dominic Toretto and Brian O'Connor is built on a very specific kind of darkness. Not the darkness of villainy, that would be manageable, comprehensible, containable. It is built on the darkness of ambiguity. The world doesn't know whether the Iron Dynasty is terrorist or protector, sovereign nation or criminal syndicate. This ambiguity is their greatest asset. Dante's plan is simple. Turn on the lights. The data breach takes him 14 months to engineer. He doesn't hack the sector's systems. He doesn't need to. He hacks the people who used to work with Dom and Brian before the sector, the people who were recruited and not recruited, the people who know things because they were present rather than because they were trusted. A supply contractor here, a decommissioned operative there, the woman who designed the sector's water reclamation system and who has, in her possession, 17 architectural schematics. The files Dante releases are not entirely accurate. This is intentional. The true files would read as complex. The files Dante releases read as damning. The ghost shipping routes presented without context. The analog relay architecture presented as offensive rather than defensive. The Edinburgh footage presented without the conversation at the end of the mile. The Nightshade device presented as a weapon of mass destruction held by private citizens. The world receives them on a Tuesday. By Thursday, 3 governments have called emergency sessions. By Friday, Time magazine has a cover that reads, "The Iron Dynasty, the most dangerous coup in the world." Mia looks at the cover for a very long time. "They're not wrong," she says, finally, which is the most devastating thing anyone says all week. Rome is Dante's trap, and Brian sees it coming 6 hours early, which is just long enough to be insufficient. The G7 summit, the Piazza Navona bomb, theatrical, precise, designed not to kill, but to detonate at the exact moment when the sector's countermeasure drones would be in position to be blamed for the explosion. It is a beautiful piece of operational theater, and Brian can see every beat of it in the God's eye, can trace every relay and timing sequence, and still cannot stop it, because the bomb is analog, physical, chemical, zero digital signature, and the God's eye is blind to things that have no data footprint. Dom drives into Rome with the Charger, because there is no other choice. No tech. The countermeasures are offline. Dante has used a variant of Brian's own blackout tech, stolen from the Edinburgh debrief files in the data breach, to suppress the sector's support systems in a 12-block radius around the piazza. Just Dom, the Charger. 40,000 people in the square who don't know what's 3 meters below the fountain. Dom does not defuse the bomb. He doesn't have the skill set, and humility is one of the few things that have grown uncorrupted in the sector years. What Dom does is drive. He drives the way only Dom drives. Not fast, not technically, but inevitably, with the kind of physics-adjacent conviction that has always made his cars do things cars don't do. He attaches the grapple to the bomb housing, drives the Charger at full acceleration away from the square, and the explosive, rigged to a timer, not a remote trigger, because Dante planned for the tech-assisted deactivation that isn't coming, detonates in the river. The piazza holds. The Charger doesn't. Dom walks away from the wreckage in a white shirt, covered in dust and Tiber water. Around him, 40,000 people who will never know how close Thursday came. Brian watches it on the God's Eye feed from the sector and realizes, looking at his partner standing in the wreckage of a car in the middle of Rome's most famous river, that the emperor who just saved the city looks indistinguishable, from certain angles, from a man who has lost everything. They won Rome. They lost everything else. The time cover is already in 40 languages. The files are in every newsroom on Earth. The empire is no longer a shadow. It is a spotlight, and everything looks different in a spotlight. The siege starts at dawn. Cypher has rebuilt her architecture. Of course she has. The Nightshade pulse that destroyed her drone access was a setback, not a defeat. And Cypher treats setbacks the way water treats obstacles. And Dante has provided what she needed most: the sector's internal schematics, the architectural files, the one surviving copy of Brian's analog relay diagrams that the data breach had extracted. They come together the way disasters come together, not through coordination, but through convergence. Two forces that want the same result for entirely different reasons, arriving at the same point at the same time. The sector's outer defense perimeter falls at 0617. Not catastrophically, it doesn't fall in an explosion or a breach. It falls silently, system by system, as Cypher's penetration finds the analog backdoor she left behind the first time, and discovers, with professional satisfaction, that it was never fully closed. The 3 months Brian spent rebuilding the Nightshade array post-pulse had not included a comprehensive audit of the 1973 Soviet relay chassis. He'd meant to get to it. There had been other priorities. This is how empires end, Brian thinks, watching the defense grid go red station by station, not in one catastrophic blow, in the accumulation of things you meant to get to. The crew assembles in the operations center, Roman with a weapon he's holding incorrectly, and the focused expression of a man who has decided to die competently. Tej at 3 terminals simultaneously, fingers moving through countermeasures like a pianist in the third movement of something too fast. Letty at Dom's right shoulder, the way she has always been, not protective of Dom, but aligned with him. The way two things align when they've survived the same heat. Ramsey in the corner, working a parallel track with the practiced silence of someone solving a very large math problem under very poor conditions. Shaw at the door with the look of a man who has made his calculations and decided this particular fight is worth the entry fee. Hahn, who has always been the quietest and therefore the most likely to be the last one standing, at the secondary console. Jacob Toretto, standing at the far wall. Present because family shows up, because that is what family does. Mia holds Jack's hand. The boy is too young to understand the specifics and old enough to feel the tone of the room. Dom looks at Brian. Brian looks at Dom. And in the space between them, in the particular frequency of everything that has happened since a Spanish tarmac at the end of a long runway, they have the same conversation they had the first time, without words, the way men do when they've been through enough together that language is no longer the most efficient medium. Brian's eyes say, the network is compromised. Cypher and Dante have the keys. If we fight, we lose everything in a battle and they get the infrastructure. If we surrender, they get the infrastructure and we're contained. A pause. But if we initiate Code Zero, Dom's eyes say, the total self-destruction. We designed it for this, the last option. Brian, everything, not just the tech. The routes, the accounts, the God's Eye integration, everything we built. Dom. The family? Brian walks away clean, because there's nothing left to prosecute. Dom looks at the room, at Roman, who once told him that he drives for a family, and the family is worth more than any car. At Tej, who built the most sophisticated private intelligence network in history, because Dom asked him to, and because Dom's trust is the kind of trust that makes people want to deserve it. At Letty, who died and came back and never once asked the Empire for anything it didn't have. At Mia, who was right about everything from the beginning and had the grace to only say I told you so with her eyes. Once, briefly. At Jack, 6 years old, who asked why they live on a boat. Code Zero, Dom says. Brian's hand is already on the console. It's irreversible, he says. Not a question, not a warning, just naming the thing. I know, Dom says. The whole empire, gone. I know. Brian initiates it. The sequence takes 47 seconds. They know this because they designed it. Brian had been characteristically specific about the cascade timing, the order in which each layer would purge, the way the analog relays would kill themselves from the inside out, each circuit board self-corrupting in a chain reaction that no external force could interrupt once begun. He had designed it at 3 in the morning. 8 months into the sector's construction, On a night when Dom was asleep and the Atlantic was rough, and Brian was sitting in the operations center with a cup of cold coffee and the sudden, clear knowledge that all of this could go wrong. He had always known they would need a door. He had never wanted to walk through it. He walks through it now. Cipher, somewhere in the data architecture of a system she was 3 minutes from fully penetrating, encounters the zero propagation front, and, Brian imagines, understands immediately what it is. He imagines her sitting very still, the way she does when she is processing something that has genuinely surprised her. He imagines her tilting her head very slightly. He imagines her saying to no one in particular, "Huh, the Empire dies in 47 seconds. The sector's lights don't go out. The structural systems, power, water, air, the things that keep people alive, are on a separate circuit, physically isolated." Brian had thought of that too. He's always thought of that, the human layer beneath the operational one, the thing underneath the thing. When the sequence completes, Tage looks up from his terminals. Dark, he says, with the soft wonder of a man watching something he built become something it never was. Absent. Outside, Cipher's penetration expires into nothing. Dante's siege evaporates, not because it's defeated, but because there is nothing left to siege. You cannot storm a treasury that has no gold. The sector is still standing. It's just a platform now, steel and coral, and a garage full of exceptional cars. Roman breaks the silence. "Okay," he says, "so, are we rich or broke? Because I need to adjust my energy." The laughter that follows is not the laughter of triumph. It is the specific laughter of people who have been holding their breath for 2 years and have suddenly, unexpectedly, been permitted to exhale. The house in Barstow is not their house. It belongs to one of Dom's uncles, a man of 71 who asks no questions and grows persimmons in his backyard, and has not owned a television since 2009, because he found the experience too loud. He gave them the house for as long as you need it, which is uncle language for forever, and nobody has corrected him. They are here for 11 days before Mia drives to the supermarket and comes back with groceries and a copy of the LA Times in which their names do not appear. She puts the newspaper on the kitchen table without comment. Dom makes carnitas. This fact, its sheer domestic normalcy after everything, is so disorienting that Roman has to sit down in the middle of the kitchen and stare at the ceiling until it makes sense. Tej finds him there 10 minutes later. "You okay?" Tej asks. "He's making carnitas," Roman says. "Yeah, with an apron. I see that. An apron that says Grill Sergeant. I know. I'm having a spiritual experience, Tej. Have it outside. He needs the counter space. The Empire is gone. This is factually true. The accounts have zeroed. The routes are dead. The sector's operational infrastructure exists nowhere except in the memories of the people who built it, and the dreams of the intelligence agencies that spent 2 years trying to dismantle it. The God's eye is dark. The drones are at the bottom of the Atlantic. What remains? 6 cars and a rented storage unit on the edge of the Mojave. A set of Social Security numbers held in reserve for exactly this contingency by a man in Portland who has never met any of them but who processes documents for a living and owes Dom a favor whose origins he prefers not to discuss. Enough cash, analog, physical, untraceable, for a modest start. A family. Brian talks to the FBI field office in Phoenix on the phone from the uncle's kitchen, standing at the window looking at the persimmon trees, using his real name for the first time in 2 years. The agent on the other end, young, careful, not hostile, tells him there are ongoing discussions about prior operational status that make immediate prosecution procedurally complex, which is bureaucratic for, "We're not sure what you are, and we're less sure what to do about it." "Tell them we're done," Brian says. "Done how?" "All the way done," Brian says. "We'll cooperate with appropriate review processes. Anything that was ours is gone. Anything that was government property was always government property. We're civilians." A long pause on the line. "I'll pass that along," the agent says, carefully. Brian hangs up. Mia is standing in the doorway. She has heard enough. He crosses the kitchen in 5 steps, and she leans her forehead against his chest, and they stand like that for a while in the morning quiet. "The Buster," she says quietly. "Still here," Brian says. "He was always here. He just got lost for a while." The barbecue happens on a Saturday. No drones, No satellites, no God's eye, no ghost routes, no nightshade field, no encrypted relay in a repurposed Soviet chassis. The Mojave sky is lavender and the persimmon trees throw long shadows, and Roman is operating the speakers with the confidence of a man who has survived the end of an empire and emerged with his playlist fully intact. Tej is explaining to Han why the thermal dynamics of Dom's carnitas are scientifically perfect. Han is listening to this with the expression of a man who has heard about 1,000 things that are scientifically perfect from Tej, and has chosen to accept them all without comment as the price of friendship. Jakob is in the corner of the yard talking to little Dom. Elena's boy, the serious-faced child who has his mother's eyes and his father's jaw, and who is, at this moment, explaining something complicated about trucks to a man who recently fought a civil war, and is now receiving this explanation with complete and genuine attention. Letty is at the grill beside Dom because that is where she is, always. Not in front of him, not behind him, beside him, the two of them oriented to the same horizon. They hear the car before they see it. That specific sound of American V8 that carries a particular authority, not aggressive, just certain of itself. A black GMC Suburban rolls to a stop at the edge of the driveway. Hobbs gets out. He is not in uniform. He is wearing a shirt that fits poorly around the shoulders, which is a structural inevitability given to shoulders. He has a 6-pack of Coronas in one hand. He looks at the gathering in the yard, at the cars parked along the fence, at the barbecue smoke rising into the lavender sky, at the specific and improbable family that has assembled in a Barstow backyard after the end of everything, and his face does the thing it does when Hobbs is processing an emotion he doesn't have a word for. He walks to Dom, hands him a Corona. "Heard you were in the neighborhood," Hobbs says. Hobbs looks at the house, at the cars, at Jack, who is running across the yard with the focused joy of a 6-year-old who has recently discovered that grass is a real thing you can run on, at Brian, who has emerged from the kitchen with a bowl of something and who stops when he sees Hobbs and holds very still, and then, slowly, with the particular care of a man picking up something he thought was gone, smiles. "You bringing handcuffs?" Dom asks. "Brought beer." Hobbs says handcuffs are a tomorrow problem. He pops the cap on his own Corona, or a never problem, depending on how the next few weeks go. Dom cracks his Corona. He looks at the garage, visible through the gate, the Charger and the R34 parked side by side, their silhouettes like punctuation marks at the end of a very long sentence. Brian drifts across the yard to stand beside him. They look at the cars together. "We had it all, Dom," Brian says. "The whole world." Dom is quiet for a moment, watching his son run across the grass. "We were looking in the wrong direction, Brian." He takes a long pull of the Corona. The lavender sky does its lavender thing above them, indifferent to history. "I don't need a world. I just need a block." Later, when the kids are asleep and the crew is scattered between lawn chairs and the persimmon trees and the comfortable